as the speakers, it will start Giulia Gentile, that she's coming from Napoli, but she's a lecturer in the University of Essex. Then we will have Beatrice, which now I'm sorry, I will probably be mistaken the pronunciation of the surname, MONCIUNSKAITE, sorry. And then Jacquelyn VERALDI, that she's from the CEU, and they're going to be talking today about the digitalization, pandemics, and then the challenges and opportunities about the adoption of a social contract from in a context of EU democratic deficit. As I said, I wanted to welcome you all. It's really a pleasure to have you today. And the schedule that we have is that you talk about 15, 20 minutes, and then we aim to have some questions and answers from the participants, and then we move forward. So again, thank you very much. Giulia, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Perfect. So good morning or good evening, depending where you are in the world. It's great to have you here and to have the chance to discuss together the challenges of digitization and the social contract. I have some slides to share, so I will attempt to do that now. Hopefully you can see well.
Yes, we can.
Perfect. Yes. Thank you so much, Virginia, for confirming. So digitization. Well, we have been discussing around the challenges and the issues that emerge from digital technologies for quite some time now. But the reality is that technology has featured across the entire history of humanity. And in fact, it suffices to go back to the 20th century, so not that far ago, to see that in reality, technology has really progressed in parallel with human developments. And as beautifully put, in my view, by Václav Smil in his book, Creating the 20th Century, the reality is that technology is part of humanity. But he makes also this very important point, technology does not equate to human process, to human progress, in the sense that with every technology, we can identify some winners, but also some losers. And this is because, in fact, technology, as we will discuss in a few minutes, technology is a form of restructuring and reorganizing power. So inevitably, with all types of technological progress, we also see that there are certainly some parts of the society that can gain out of this progress, but also, and inevitably, unfortunately, also some other sections of the society that instead could be negatively impacted by technology. But let's focus in particular on digitization. And I would like to ask you to take a couple of minutes to access this poll. So I've included a QR code that you can scan and should directly take you to the poll, as well as you can access this poll through the link that I've included here with the access code. So could you please access this poll and provide your answer to the question, what is digitization? So I will wait perhaps 1 or 2 minutes so that all of you can access the link and give your answer. So I hope that you all are in the poll by now. Can you please give me a sign in the chat, perhaps? You can also find the links in the chat. You should be able to access them. I will copy them again in the chat. Is everyone in the poll?
You can answer on the chat.
I can share again, perhaps, the QR code so that you can access it more easily, perhaps. So this is the QR code.
I can see the QR code.
Okay, perfect. You can see the QR code.
Yes.
Have you managed to access the poll page?
I can't because I only have my mobile phone.
Okay, that's fine.
I hope that the rest of the
that's fine. I will
I'm in.
see.
I got it.
Oh, perfect. Excellent. So let me try and see. Okay, I'm starting receiving some answers, which is great. So far I've received 2 answers. Oh, great, 3, perfect. Excellent. I'll wait another minute to receive a couple more. Great, brilliant. So 7 answers. After all, this is a session on digitization, right? So I thought to include these elements to make it even more digital. Brilliant. So I will share the answers with you, and you will see that we are receiving quite interesting responses. So
It kind of blurred.
okay, okay, perfect. Let me try again. Can you see now?
Yes.
Brilliant.
Yes.
So
yes.
Thank you very much. I think you're providing very interesting answers because in order to understand what is the intersection between the social contract and digitization, we also need to understand first what is digitization. And I think that the answers that you have provided are really interesting. So I see that many of you have thought of digitization as progress, but also evolution, future, development, technology, digital format. Some have said that digitization is transformative, necessary, and some of you even are right. Very, very interesting. It's about value addition, and overall, it's the future. So thank you very much for these answers because they're really helpful to frame the discussion. And in fact, let's go back to the presentation. It seems that the attendees of today's sessions tend to agree, in fact, that digitization has been about progress, it has been about evolution, it has been about also improving, to a certain extent, the capabilities of humans, to those at least who have access to this technology. And digitization, if we want to give an answer to the question of what is digitization, well, strictly speaking, is the process of transforming information into data, and in particular into digits, ones and zeros, that then can be processed by computer power to perform different tasks. Computers rely on this type of technology and this type of data processing. And if we look at the last 20 years or so, we see that digital technologies have exponentially increased. We start from the broadband internet access that has allowed the democratization of the internet across the world. And as a result of the advancement of the internet, we have seen also the emergence of online platforms and algorithmic governance. meaning that online platforms such as Facebook, but also Google, Amazon, and so on, have been able to use the data that they could harness from their users also to shape their behaviors online. Online consumers have therefore become also prosumers, product and consumers at the same time, in the sense that through the data that they provided, those online platforms could extract value from that data and therefore the information included in the data. Another development in the last 20 years or so has been the emergence of the Internet of Things and big data, so tools that use data with the view to once again provide services on a large scale and also by processing large amount of data, the so-called big data. And I'm referring to in this context, for instance, tools such as Alexa, but also Roomba, the robots that can clean your home, which are technological advancements that rely on the processing of various streams of data, for instance, your voice, your questions, but also the surface of your house. And after these developments, we have, of course, what is really at the forefront of current debates, which is artificial intelligence, which is a technology that has existed since the 1950s. But in terms of advancements, we see now currently the big booming of this technology in the form of, for instance, generative AI that use neural networks, but also other tools such as applications of AI used in the medical sector. And what is, in my view, the future, we have quantum computing. Now we have, of course, some advancements in this area, but of course, we're not there yet. The future is still to happen in a way. But what is the result of all these advancements from a digital perspective? Well, these advancements impact really four crucial elements of in my view, of the social contract. First of all, these technologies impact society and impact society at large, meaning that they provide capabilities and affordances to individuals, but in so doing, they also reshape the ways in which individuals interact with each other, but also with authority. And this brings me to the second impact that technology has on the social contract, which is the creation of new infrastructures. I said at the very beginning of this presentation that digitization is a form of technology, and as such, it's also a form of restructuring and reordering power. Of course, digitization relies on certain infrastructures and resources, infrastructures, for instance, databases, computers, but also AI system, for instance, as well as resources such as data, but also the human element that power both the resources and the infrastructures. And by creating these new resources and infrastructures, digitization ultimately affects the way in which power is exercised. So we have new centers for power, and this power can also mingle with state authorities, for instance, when the state embeds digitization in its own functioning. And ultimately, digitization works as a meta power, we can say, in the sense that it reshapes the identity of individuals, of interactions between private parties, but also between private parties and authorities. And in reshaping these interactions and relationships, ultimately digitization has the power also to impact the values that bind us to each other and towards institutions. So in a way, digitization inserts itself into what we can call as a social technological ecosystem. And of course, we may have also various ecosystems depending on whether we look at states, depending on whether we look at international organizations, and so on. So digitization has certainly far-reaching effects when it comes to the ways in which we interact with each other and the rules that bind us to each other. So in light of this very far-reaching transformation, I have another question for you. And once again, I would kindly ask you to access another poll through this link and this access code. I can also include them in the chat, but probably I will leave this link and access code just for a minute here. I will also include it in the chat so that you can all access more easily. So I'll wait a few minutes for you to have the chance to access the poll. So I'm still waiting for your answers.
Now it's charging. I could enter before, but it took like a while to.
Sure, no problem.
to load.
Okay, I see I'm starting receiving responses. That's brilliant. I will share with you the screen. Okay, 2 responses. How should states and international organizations respond to the challenges of digitization? So it's quite interesting. Before we heard that digitization is progress, it's the future, it's even a right. But I see now that the responses are much more cautious now. I read, first of all, developing regulation, legal framework, ensure accessibility, active implementation, encourage digitization, bridging the digital divide, very interesting, respect to human rights, very, very good. So it means that digitization should not contradict and breach our human rights. We need the involvement of civil society, very, very good point. There should be transparency, brilliant. Should not, okay, states and international organizations should not interfere with digitization, very interesting. Should also foster innovation and should include people, very interesting. So it should be perhaps a democratic process and not in the hands of a few actors. International cooperation, very, very good. So I received 17 answers, so I think that we have a really good sample of what you think should be the role of states and international organizations. So these are all very great answers, and I would go as far as saying that they're very much aligned to what I'm going to talk about, in fact. Well, regulation. Many of you have mentioned that states and international organizations should adopt regulation to respond to the challenges of digital technologies. And in fact, what is the relationship, I would say, between regulation and digitization, digital technologies? Well, we see that in a way, regulation in digital technologies could work in tandem and also reinforce each other. And why? Well, if you look at the core elements of both digital technologies and regulations, there is a certain degree of overlap. If we think about digital technologies and the power to shape reality and therefore provide an answer to specific answers and tasks, we see that digital technologies seek to foster order, right? They seek to provide a form of guidance, a form of structuring of human actions and also human interactions in a way. And this is quite similar to also what regulations want to do, right? In the sense that they seek to provide order in society. I also mentioned that digital technologies are about power. They allow a restructuring of infrastructures and resources, and in so doing, they contribute towards the shaping of power. And similarly, also regulation does that. Regulation tries to constrain and govern power. Digital technologies foster certain values, such as efficiency or effectiveness. And similarly, also regulation tries to vehicle certain values. But we start seeing here at this point that regulation values and digital technologies values might not always overlap, of course. There might be different types of values that are fostered by regulation and digital technologies. What is certainly different when we look at digitization and regulation is certainly the authority that they represent. Digital technologies, especially those developed by private actors, might provide a private authority, while instead regulation always is linked to a certain degree of public authority. So here we already start seeing some divergence, as well as infrastructure. Digital technologies, if you think about, for instance, even open sources AI systems that have become then private, think about OpenAI, they rely increasingly on private infrastructures, while instead regulation tries to make infrastructure as public as possible. So there are certain synergies, but also tensions. And this brings me to the biggest challenges that therefore regulation has when it comes to digital technologies and infrastructures. The first is a challenge of effectiveness. How do we used regulation to effectively govern digital infrastructures and technologies? And the second challenge is a challenge around space, we can say. How much space should regulation give to technology, and vice versa? How do we ensure that technologies digital technologies do not advance to a degree that really impedes the development of regulation that could also, in a way, help foster certain values that are, for instance, public and that are about the common good. So in my view, these are the biggest challenges. And what about the EU in this context? What has been the response of the EU in this field? Well, the EU has certainly embraced the regulatory challenge by adopting a plethora of instruments. And we can see that the EU has issued measures in 5 fields, above all: data, cyber protection, platforms, content, and AI. And in particular, in the last 10 years or so, there has been a very heated discussion in the EU around the EU AI Act, the Digital Services Act, the Digital Market Act, and other instruments that are part of the new EU digital package. So the EU is positioning itself as one of the most comprehensive regulators of digitization. But this doesn't mean, nonetheless, that this regulation is necessarily effective. So if we go back to the transformations that digitization brings in society, so societal transformation, infrastructures, powers, and values, we see that there might not always be an alignment between the regulatory ambitions of the EU and how these 4 elements interact with each other. And we can see this tension, for instance, if we look at the EU AI Act, that provides a comprehensive set of rules for AI systems. And in particular, the EU AI Act provides also a classification of various types of AI systems, dividing them in prohibited, high risk, medium risk, and low risk. And in particular, for the systems that are of high risk, those that provide these systems should comply with certain standards, with certain requirements before high risk AI is marketed. And one of the high risk AI system is that that could be deployed in the context of justice systems. So the EU AI Act provides that AI systems could be used in the justice realm to complement, for instance, the activities of judges across the EU. However, we have an interesting tension between, of course, this societal transformation brought by AI, as well as the power, infrastructures, and values that govern the EU. One of the values that governs the EU, in fact, is the rule of law, which is one of the founding values of the EU. And the rule of law demands that EU institutions and member states comply with the principle of judicial independence. Courts should be independent. But how would an AI system used in the justice field intersect with judicial independence when we think about the following challenges? First of all, AI systems tend to be black boxes. It is quite difficult in many cases to understand why an AI system has reached a certain decision. Think about neural networks used for generative AI tools such as ChatGPT. Why has ChatGPT reached a certain answer in a specific context? But also think about the bias that is intrinsic in AI systems. Because AI systems are driven by data, inevitably this data shapes future decisions. And by shaping future decisions based on past behavior, these decisions might contain bias. So how do these challenges around AI align with the values of judicial independence and rule of law that characterize the EU social contract? So I have now prepared for us a few questions to debate the challenges that we encountered in the field of digitization and the social contract, in particular in EU context, but we can think about it in a much broader context. So the first question that I would have to discuss is what should be the role of the social contract, in particular in the EU, for instance, in the context of digitization? So how do you think the social contract should address the challenges of digitization? And if you have an answer to this question, any thoughts to share, you can do so by using the chat, but also by simply intervening orally. So what do you think should be the role of the social contract in the context of digitization? Any thoughts on this? Any ideas on how we could deploy the social contract to think about digitization? Do you think it should be just about regulation? Is it something else? Should the social contract focus rather on values, perhaps, and not so much on adopting new rules? Any thoughts on this? And if not, we can move on to the next question. There is no right or wrong answer. So it's just really brainstorming and discussing these challenges together.
I have a suggestion, maybe.
Yes.
Because it's I mean, but this is a very personal opinion, right? So I believe that once we have the first regulation of, for example, artificial intelligence, maybe the social contract should be focused in how to make effective these kind of regulations.
Yes.
So
that's that's a very good point. And the question will be, how do we make these regulations effective, right? Considering in particular these tensions that we might have between the values that govern the EU and that in a way constitute the promise of the EU and its social contract vis-a-vis the advancement of digitization. This is absolutely, I agree with you, Tony. It's a great challenge. And in fact, the second question that I have for discussion is, what principles should guide the rethinking of the EU social contract, if we need to change the EU social contract, if we need to reform it, if we need to rethink it at all when addressing the challenges of digitization. What values should we perhaps foster participation by the entire society? Should we allow specific groups to have a say? Or do you think that should institutions negotiate the social contract in this area, because perhaps digitization is very complex? We need to understand how digitization works, and therefore there's a level of expertise that perhaps is not, so to say, accessible to the entirety of the society. Do we think that member states should have a bigger role in this context to play, in parallel perhaps to EU institutions? And what is the role of international cooperation in this context? I think some of you have mentioned that international cooperation is the answer to the challenges of digitization. But well, how do we achieve effective international cooperation, considering that now digitization and, for instance, the AI technology is really at the center of tensions in the realm of geopolitics? I see that Virginia has shared in the chat digitization. I believe digitization, or the social contract, probably the social contract, should be a transversal tool, timeless, able to apply. Yes, so the social contract should be able to apply to the constant changes of technologies. Absolutely. How do we ensure that the social contract is resilient vis-a-vis digitization? We know that now we're talking about AI, but already in the previous slides, I referred to quantum computing, quantum technology. How do we ensure that any new challenges emerging from digitization can be effectively managed through the EU social contract? These are all, I think, very open and challenging questions that do not have a clear answer yet, and this is why we're all here together to discuss these challenges and reflect on how we can address them collectively. And this is, in fact, the ambition of this project, right? To embed a bottom-up perspective as well on the EU social contract that takes into account how civil society perceives the role of the social contract in this area, and how the social contract can become also more effective vis-a-vis these disruptions. So are there any comments or thoughts on this before we move on to the next slide? Oh, very interesting. In the chat, Santi is asking in which position you think the EU is in terms of AI development in comparison with US and China. Well, you might be familiar with the company called Mistral, which is a French company that is open source at the moment, and France is really trying to push for Mistral to become a global power, which perhaps is, I would say, a good development in the sense that it will create further balance, perhaps, in the geopolitics of AI, because, of course, we have the US, we have China, but then if also the EU would join the race, then there would be a more balance in the geopolitics of AI regulation. But at the same time, of course, the question is how we, so to say, consider AI just one of the challenges that society is facing, right? Across this winter school, you have heard colleagues talking about gender inequalities, but also populism. Today you will hear more about pandemics, transversal challenges. So the reality is that AI should be only part of the challenges that we are facing collectively as a society. So we should not lose sight of any other challenges. And I think when it comes to AI, hopefully there will be regulation in place to avoid big crisis, but you might be familiar, of course, with the financial crisis and the dynamics that underpin the financial crisis of 2008 and 2009. Back then, there wasn't really international cooperation around banking systems. There were not really in place safeguards when it came to the capital that banks could hold. And this created big problems, as we all know, right? And this happened in a scenario of a lack of regulation. Banks, of course, were at the forefront of innovation, right? They were creating new instruments, new financial instruments that could facilitate transaction across the world, but in a scenario of relatively lack of regulation. So I hope we don't have to reach a global financial crisis in the field of AI, a global AI crisis like the one that we have experienced in the financial sector, to have regulation that puts some safeguards. So hopefully we will have in place effective rules across the globe to avoid this kind of crisis. And this brings me perhaps to the work package that I am leading as part of the EXPRESS project, where precisely I will deal with all these questions. First of all, I will look at the impact of digitization on the EU social contract, what we have discussed only in part today. Then I will look at the EU response to digitization, how well the measures that I've referred to in the previous slides address the challenges of digitization. And then there will be an empirical interdisciplinary component to my work package that relies on a survey and the result of a pan-European survey that will be conducted around the role of the social contract, also in the context of digitization. And then as a result of this work package, I will produce 2 reports and a set of recommendations. So this is just to give you a sense of what EXPRESS² will be doing in the next months or so. And of course, you're very welcome to get in touch with me and raise any comments, any suggestion, in case you want to be involved in this work package. There will be events, there will be a workshop in the next month, so stay tuned. And this is my email if you want to get in touch with me. And I thank you very much for your attention.
Giulia, thank you very much for your presentation, which was very, very nice, very digital.
Of course,
we had to make it digital. Definitely. So I really appreciate. I would like to bring the floor for the participants if they have any question, despite that they have already provided you with a lot of questions, but maybe someone wants to have an additional question or want to make a comment on your presentation. So I don't see any hand, but due to technical issues, I can say, yeah. So if not, I will take the possibility. And yes, I believe. Well, again, we have been talking about, and I think we are sharing a lot of the questions that you are exposing, and I'm eager on the questions of effectiveness. I believe that the Santi question on the artificial intelligence and the position of the European Union, it can be crucial. But I would like also to know whether that maybe, and this is something that I would like to know your thoughts. We are not in the same position as the United States and China in the terms of the strengths and strengths, in the constraints, in the problems, in the limits that we have as Europeans. What I'm saying is that China is not a democracy, and therefore the the limits to the artificial intelligence may be different than the ones that we have. And in the United States, as we are seeing and experiencing, especially now with Donald Trump, despite that you have Barack Obama, but now with Donald Trump administration, it looks like they have, in the best case scenario, different values, right? Then we can see basically on less to be polite and less regulation, more freedom or libertarian positions. Well, we have seen the last. And if you allow me, and this is what I'm going to be a little bit not too polite, more in favor of technocracy, because they are the owners of the technocrats. The technocrats, some of them are the United States. So my question to you would be, how can we, the word is not fight, but compete or to be an actor in the sector of artificial intelligence when we have different rules, when we have different values, that there are, we have different cards in the game. What do you think? How can we save that?
Thank you, Tony. This is the $1 million question, $1 million question, right? In the sense that I'm sure that we're discussing this here, but also politicians across the world are reflecting on this in this very moment. So it's a really topical issue. How we can compete? The truth is that there is this misconception that regulation stifles innovation, in the sense that think about the following. When we have started regulating cars or regulating airplanes, this hasn't meant that cars, airplanes have disappeared, right? And the same example with banks, in the sense that the moment we have increased regulation and try to put safeguards to avoid big global crises like the financial one, this hasn't meant that banks have disappeared. So I think that there is an epistemological inaccuracy when we say that regulation stifles innovation. Innovation can be guided also by regulation, in the sense that we can create spaces in which we can produce perhaps even better technology because it might be safer. So starting from this background, I think that international cooperation is key. And the reality is that until what you mentioned earlier, until we had the technocrats, right, emerging really in the scene as part of the political power, right, in particular in jurisdictions such as the US, until that very moment, at international level, there was consensus that the technology of AI has enormous potential, but also many risks. So the question is really how collectively we decide to respond to these advancements. And the EU, I think, has had a very interesting role to play, in the sense that the EU, but not just the EU, also other jurisdictions such as Canada, but also, for instance, China. China as well has adopted many pieces of regulation in AI. Of course, they're different, but they've all made the point that, well, actually, you know, thinking about deep fakes, thinking about fake news and the spread of misinformation, AI can and is already doing this to a certain extent. AI can really upend, you know, all the assumptions that we have around, you know, what is right, what is wrong, and the trust that we can have towards not just institutions, towards each other. So I think that in light of all these challenges, we need to think that regulation has certainly a role to play, but then there is your question, Tony, how do we make it effective? And this is not easy, but this is why we have EXPRESS as well. So hopefully we will come up with interesting ideas.
Okay, so is there another question from the participants? If it's not the case, we are in 10:45. It is British punctuality. Then I want to again, grazie mille Giulia per la tua
My
presentazione.
pleasure.
È stato molto. And now I will give the floor to Beatrice MONCIUNSKAITE of the University of Dublin City University, and then she's going to talk about the other disruptive element, which is the pandemics. So Beatrice, the floor is yours. Thank you very much. We are eager to see your presentation. The floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Antoni. So hi everyone, welcome to sunny Dublin. The sun has come out for the first time in 10 days. Just bear with me while I share my screen. Okay, I don't know why this is not working. Sorry, it says that I need permission to share my screen.
Okay, you should have, but you can try to going out and entering in again, or you can send me the presentation and I can add the slides for you.
Okay, I will probably send the presentation. That probably will be quicker. Now I've sent it to you, Virginia, directly.
Okay, let me see. I'm checking my mail.
Can you see? Okay, no, that doesn't work.
Okay, I got the mail. And I'm opening the file. I have a presentation, Beatrice, but it's only 4 slides.
Oh, hold on. Okay, I've sent you the correct slides now.
Okay. I'll check it right away.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. Okay.
Okay.
Technical disaster averted. Thanks, Virginia. So again, thank you so much for inviting me here. I'm very excited to talk about the impact that the pandemic has had on standards of democracy and human rights, and of course the social contract. So the way I see the pandemic is kind of like a tipping point in the global decline in democratic human rights and liberal values. So it's not that those values had not been in trouble before the pandemic, but the pandemic certainly accelerated the issues, or maybe brought the issues that were simmering away in societies on a latent level to the forefront, and really put a magnifying glass on these issues. So this is exactly the perspective I study in terms of the social contract and how to improve the social contract to ensure that something like a peripheral event, like a pandemic, doesn't have catastrophic effects on democracy, the rule of law, and liberal values and human rights. Can I have the next slide, please? Thank you. So some statistics to set the scene regarding the impact that the pandemic has had on democracy and human rights. So Freedom House reported in 2023 that global freedom has been in decline for the 17th year in a row. So this is very obviously pointing to the fact that democracy and human rights have been in trouble for far long before the pandemic. Essentially, this is for various reasons, but there is a definite acceleration of the decline in these standards when the pandemic arrived. So Freedom House also reported that 80 countries had regressed in freedom in the first year of the pandemic. So this is a staggering number, and this is for various reasons. So research points to the fact that there were significant restrictions of civil liberties for extended periods of time during the pandemic. And these were most of the time warranted, right? So societies consented to the restriction of their freedom, the restriction of their civil liberties, in an effort to combat the infection, the COVID-19 infection, and to prevent deaths. But in some countries, in countries that had already been experiencing democratic deficits for a number of years before, this was exacerbated by authoritarian-leaning leaders. So there was a propensity for authoritarian-leaning leaders to use emergency situations, declarations of emergency situations, to ensure that their power was further entrenched than it already was. Sorry, sir. Oh, sorry, that was a question. So there was a propensity for already authoritarian leaders that were looking for excuses for power grabs to use the pandemic as an excuse to further entrench their power. So a really classic example of this was, of course, seen in Hungary, the Fidesz government and Viktor Orban using successive emergency orders to basically ensure that the executive could rule by decree for extended periods of time. And situations like this really impacts the trust that a polity will have in their government. And of course, the social contract is premised on the idea of trust. So we give away our unlimited freedom to a government, trusting that they will provide security in return. So a pandemic, a really severe emergency situation that destabilizes this contract based on trust is detrimental to the quality of democracy and human rights, especially when it is an unprecedented event and it's extended for indefinitely. So we didn't really know how long the pandemic would take to resolve. Further, the Economist Intelligence Unit in 2021 reported that democracy had undergone backsliding in every region of the world. So in the space of less than a year from 2020's when the pandemic had started, and we already were seeing reports that democracy was in severe decline in Central and Eastern Europe, in the US as well, and these were all linked events, according to some researchers, due to the demise of, or the failure of, liberalism to basically deliver the goods financially for people, but also ensure cultural and border security. Liberalism had largely failed, so we were already seeing a decline in liberal democratic standards. And then once the pandemic hit, it only took less than a year really to see an even further acceleration of regression in democratic and human rights standards in every region of the world. And perhaps the most remarkable thing about this situation was that the rollbacks in civil liberties were particularly highlighted, maybe for empirical research reasons, in already full democracies. So there were many instances of full democracies losing or slipping in their democratic standards significantly. So, of course, let's go back to the example of Hungary. Since 2022, Freedom House no longer considers Hungary to be a full democracy. And that was very much facilitated and accelerated the existing problems that were already in Hungary. It was accelerated by the pandemic. And from 2022 onwards, Hungary is no longer considered a full democracy. Can I have the next slide, please? So how do we conceptualize the link between the struggle of the social contract to produce the goods that people want, and linking this to the pandemic? So like I said, the pandemic was not the sole cause of loss of trust in government, in a state, but rather a magnifying glass on existing issues that were simmering away on a latent level, that were causing dissatisfaction with the status quo of the political regime in a particular state. And this can be boiled down to three factors. And I think Seek in 2023 really summarized these perfectly. By intensifying long-lasting paradoxes of modernization, the pandemic facilitates collective reflection. So those challenges which had been burdened late modernity for a long time, both on the level of freedom, for example, fragmentation of collective life world due to individualization. So here we can think about the classic debate of the culture wars. Justice, so the increasing global and local inequality. In particular, I think here we can speak to material inequality that has been growing in states in recent years due to economic reasons, the cost of living crisis, digitalization, as we've already discussed today, and a plethora of other issues. And then also sustainability. So we're talking about sustainability and global warming and protecting the environment a lot more. And this is something that I think traditionally the social contract hasn't really encompassed. So how do we use natural resources? How do we abuse natural resources? And what does the social contract have to say about this? And in a way, the pandemic, due to social factors like our increased interaction on a social level, cities growing populations, and the spread of the pandemic through country to country in a really accelerated way due to international travel, does our view of natural resources and how we view the environment have something to say about the impact, the drastic impact a global pandemic has had on not only global health, but also political and democratic instability? So all of these factors suddenly become multidimensional. So we're seeing these factors as fragmented, but the pandemic really brought them all into focus. So we were seeing them through a magnifying glass, and everything was quite heated in the global level in terms of discussing all of these various issues. And it really was a kind of a shock to the system, I think, for global economies and global political systems, the impact that a biological disaster can have on our societies and democracy and human rights. Can I have the next slide, please? Thank you. Okay, so I've mentioned a few of these already, and in the slide, I've kind of collated a few of the pre-existing factors that were already affecting standards of human rights and liberal democracy before the pandemic. And these have been gathered from the literature that exists in the field of democratic backsliding and rule of law backsliding. But I really want us to think about now what effect the pandemic might have had on these factors. So, and if I've missed any of these, you can put them, if you think I've missed any of these factors that you think are important, you can put them in the chat or unmute yourself and say them. This is a list that is quite flexible. So for example, I put globalization at the top because I think the pandemic was an example of how globalization, so international travel and technological advances have highlighted a problem in the way we interact as different communities across the world. Globalization also has had an impact on the feeling of insecurity within states. So I'm thinking in particular here, for example, some Central and Eastern European states that have had declines in their standards of liberal democracy in the last decade, for example. A lot of that decline has been attributed to the divide between the rural communities and the urban communities. The urban communities in cities, for example, being populated by socially mobile, well-educated citizens that have job security, and then contrast that with rural communities who feel like they have been left behind by globalization and technological advances. And they feel insecurity in their own material or financial standing. Then this was exacerbated by the financial crisis. So the financial crisis, since the financial crisis, I think we've all heard of this, the division between the poorest and the wealthiest in societies has grown deeper, and the middle class has been deteriorating in many Western democracies, and that further exacerbates feelings of insecurity, inequality. We've already discussed in Giulia's presentation technological advances, so I won't go over these again, and how technological advances have also highlighted certain inequalities in society. But in particular, I think we should talk about social media, and this is something I spoke about with my students in my jurisprudence class, and I know some of you are here today. The impact of social media on the way communities have perceived the pandemic. So here, particularly, we need to be very aware of fake news, misinformation, and how quickly misinformation had spread, and the impact that misinformation and fake news spread via social media. So it spreads like wildfire via social media before elections, before democratic elections. So that has an immediate effect on the quality of democratic outcomes. And then the last point there that I think we haven't really discussed yet is, of course, the proximity of border insecurity. So the proximity of wars, multiple wars erupting in the last 4 years. So I'm speaking specifically here, a war that erupted very close to European borders, or European Union borders, but it was technically in Europe, the Ukraine war in 2022, in the middle of the pandemic. So that also was an additional factor that the pandemic catalyzed in a way. And then, of course, we had the war in the Middle East more recently. So my question to you, and I'll open up the floor if you want to unmute yourself and say any particular points that you found interesting so far, or highlight anything that you think I've missed. How do you think the factors that I mentioned here, or any other factors, have contributed to the erosion of trust in government, which directly impacts the social contract standing? So, like I said, the pandemic is a catalyzing event. But how do we link the pandemic and, for example, the issues surrounding globalization, and then the product of weakened social contract or trust in government and this weakened social contract? Any thoughts on this? You could also use the chat if you would like.
Hello, I have maybe, I don't know if it's an answer, but I mean, it's simply a thought, right? So I believe that it's not really, maybe, it's not how the factors have contributed, but how the governments has answered to these factors, right? And then, so the way that you measure the trust that the people has in the governments maybe depends not on the concrete factor, but the regulations, deregulation, information, and how they behave when they are facing these different factors that you are mentioning. So maybe the question would be how the trust is related with the action of the government, and not only on these factors that you are mentioning. On the other hand, these factors are stressing governments because there are huge elements that can affect their trust, but also at the same time they can be very, very good opportunities in order to reinforce trust, depending on how do you answer. I have the example of pandemics. Is a very good example on how the government, how to measure government's reactions, in the sense that if you see some people expected more regulation, more control, and other people expected less regulation, less control in times of pandemic, and then affected the way that people trusted their own governments. So, but that's a thought. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Antoni. So I think exactly what you've said, that's completely correct. The way I think of it regarding how the government actually reacts, well, this depends on the situation and the goals of the government already. So when they're faced with a situation like a pandemic, I feel like there is an appetite from a polity for conclusive action. So this is why there is a propensity for governments to choose emergency situations, so that they have more executive power. So executive dominance leads to more conclusive or faster decision making. But this, of course, lends itself very well to already authoritarian leaning leaders to abuse these this executive dominance for their own benefit rather than for the benefit of society. And this is what is impacting the trust that a polity might have in their government. So that's an excellent point. I'll move on to the next slide if there's no questions on this particular point, because we will be able to come back to it. So I guess what the question is, the million-dollar question is, can a new social contract fix our trust in democracy, and how do we exactly go about this? So if we think back to social contract theory, it says that political legitimacy is the ability of government to protect those who have consented to its social contract. So this means that if there is a lack of security or a feeling of lack of security, then there is legitimate reason to think that there is no social contract, or there's a legitimate reason to dispute the social contract status quo. So if we think back to the early philosophers and theorists, so Jean-Jacques Rousseau would say that a polity has not only the ability to strive for reform of the social contract or a revolution, but they have a responsibility, if the social contract is broken, to strive for revolution to fix that situation. Social contract theory is, I think, particularly abstract. Of course, it's abstract. It's a metaphor. No one is born and no one signs a contract, a physical contract, when they're a baby. But I think what is important to realize is that the social contract has the power in fixing something like this, a problem of really abstract or global issues, because it acknowledges that humans have individual and rational ideas of what their perception of good is, so they can make informed decisions. I'll move on to the next slide there. Okay. So what underpins the feelings of insecurity in a polity? So if we can boil down what we've already discussed into a few factors of what exactly insecurity is. So if you could just click the space button one more time. Yeah. So I think material inequality is particularly important to understand here, and how the pandemic exacerbated, like I said, the divide between the poorest in society and the richest in society. Rawls's social contract theory, for example, really tries to minimize material inequality in society, and material inequality in society is seen by him, for example, to be a major factor in dissatisfaction in social contracts. I'll go to the next point. Or, for example, is it cultural insecurity? So did the pandemic in any way exacerbate other factors? So, for example, in the context of Europe, we have migration crises and refugee crises that were manifold. So we had ones that were manufactured by Russia and Belarus, and I'm thinking here particularly in the middle of the pandemic, we had the funneling of refugees and migrants deliberately from Belarus into the Baltic states in like a political retaliation against sanctions. Or, for example, maybe it was just the influx of refugees already that we were seeing in Europe before the pandemic, and the changing demographics in societies in Europe, for example, that led to a feeling of cultural insecurity, which the reaction to this being kind of an ethno-centric conception of identity, and therefore which is something that contributes to people voting in a very right-leaning or conservative manner. Next point, please. And then border insecurity that was exacerbated by multiple wars that really, in particular in Eastern Europe and Central Eastern Europe, the war in Ukraine led to real insecurities in a polity or in society around border security. So real questioning around whether NATO will actually step in and protect the Baltic states if Russia encroaches, especially in the wake of the Ukraine war. But even now, since we had the changeover in presidency in the US and the US gradually removing themselves from, or even normatively from, trusting that NATO is a valuable resource, we again see this border insecurity in Eastern Europe around really an unprecedented situation where we didn't think we might be. So in the 90s and in the early 2000s, we thought that at the end of history was on the horizon, and that the borders established post the fall of the Berlin Wall were going to be the borders that stayed in Europe. But now we really cannot say this for certain anymore. I'll move on to the next point. I think it's a question about other factors. Okay, so having understood these three factors, do you think I have missed any? I think I might have missed one on purpose, just to see whether everyone was listening. But aside from material inequality, cultural insecurity, and border insecurity, do you think other factors also contribute to the dissatisfaction of the current performance of the social contract? I see Giulia says legality. So like, do you mean the rule of law crisis in particular here?
Perhaps I'll just speak in the sense that I'm referring to legal in the context of frameworks that essentially could lead to unequal outcomes, and therefore because of laws that perhaps might not necessarily be, broadly speaking, just, then the system could further exacerbate the feeling of insecurity.
Yeah, that's really well put. Exactly. Procedural inequality in the way decisions are made during emergency situations like a pandemic. Of course, that's the whole point of an emergency situation, that major checks and balances are removed in an effort to secure efficiency, to stop an emergency happening. But the situation that we saw in response to the pandemic was an abuse of these emergency powers in already weakened democracies. And this is a major issue. Another thing, in the context of globalization, and I think the pandemic had made the world, or made countries and societies really consider the benefits of globalization. So they may have had a propensity to look more inwards in response to the pandemic, to really secure their own benefits, and then leave everyone else. So it was kind of like every man for himself a situation. And I'm specifically speaking here about, like, for example, in the early days of the pandemic, shortages of PPE that were produced in China, for example. And of course, there was a huge global demand for this during the pandemic. And we had a situation of countries hoarding PPE. And then later in the pandemic, once we had access to vaccines, we had a huge issue of countries hoarding, more wealthy countries hoarding vaccines, which obviously disadvantaged third world countries that didn't have the wealth or the financial dominance in the global setting to secure their own vaccines. So I think the globalization has really highlighted the a more inward-looking tendency of some, especially wealthy countries, in the wake of the pandemic. I think there's one more point on that slide. Was there a question there? No? Okay. So the question I think we can all conclude with is how can society, how can social contract theory address these concerns and prevent a peripheral event like a pandemic from upending democracy and human rights? So the point being that a pandemic is something that isn't caused necessarily by legal reasons or by society per se. It is a biological occurrence, and it's something that various experts on global health say that is going to come up again and again. So the larger the population, the more interaction we have with wild animals, so the increase in zoonotic disease risks, the higher the risk of another global pandemic and a novel virus breaking through our healthcare barriers and causing yet another global pandemic. So this is an issue that we need to be prepared for. And many experts will say that actually it is more likely than ever that we will have many pandemics in the coming century, and more so than in the previous century, because of various factors like increased population and our interconnectedness and international travel and so on. So we really need to be prepared for something like this to happen again, and think about how we can fortify and create liberal democracies and create bulwarks against the abuse of emergency powers, or using pandemics as an excuse to aggrandize or entrench executive dominance even further. So I'll leave it there, and I'll open up the floor to any questions or any comments that anyone might have, or if you can think of anything that may be a solution to the problem of pandemics for liberal democracies and the social contract. I'm very happy to hear these. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I'm sorry about all these technical issues. You know, I'm also suffering these 3 days, this horrible connection in my faculty. So, you know, it's also a way to get resilient to this to digital problems, let's say. So I mean, I don't know whether we can find a solution, right? Because it is very ambitious to find solutions, and especially because, you know, as I do, that social contracts normally are also made on the image of the people who vote for political parties, and these governments have their own ideas. So depending how you define also the social contract, you will have also a potential solution or not. I'm thinking when we're talking about pandemics, that this big debate, and when we were suffering pandemics and reclusion, there was a big debate between two important philosophers, Zizek and Agamben, and you will see they were completely opposite in a completely opposite solution, and both of them with very rational solutions, rational arguments, I would say. So it depends probably which of your political ideas, questions of freedom, etc., you will be positioning in one or in the other side, and therefore the solution that you will find will be also conditioned by your own or the government own ideas. So I really look eager to work with you in the social contract on this, and to how to with the colleagues in Dublin to find a way to propose. But the thing that's also my opinion, any solution should be democratically legitimate, right? At the end of the day, so it cannot be imposed. Even that pandemics is also a question that is scientifically and it has been sometimes criticized that the solutions were not democratically back or support. So, well, sorry for this long comment. I really thank you very much for your presentation. I really look eager to work with you on this topic in our project. Thank you very much again.
Thank you, Antoni.
You're very welcome. And now the last of the speakers of today is Jacquelyn VERALDI. She's going to be talking about intersections, which as you has already experienced today and the other days. When we are discussing these disruptive elements, we immediately see that they are interconnected. So we thought with Professor Koshenov and with the people of the CEU that it would be interesting to have a work package dealing with the intersection of all these disruptive elements or some of the disruptive elements at the same moment, meaning that maybe populism and the response to pandemics are also related, and therefore there is an interconnection to be analyzed and how this will affect the drafting, but also the interpretation and the ironcladding of the social contract. So, thank you very much, Jacquelyn. The floor is yours.
Great, thank you very much. Everyone can see my screen, okay?
Yes, I do.
Yeah. Great. Okay, so good morning, everyone. My name is Jacquelyn VERALDI. You can call me Jack. I'm a postdoctoral researcher with the Central European University Democracy Institute in Budapest, specialized in EU constitutional law. Today, I'm going to talk to you about the challenges and opportunities that arise in relation to the creation of the EU social contract when we are operating in the context of a democratic deficit. And I think a lot of the disruptive factors that we've been discussing throughout this winter school arguably contribute to that democratic deficit. And I want to save that discussion for the Q&A to get your ideas on this. In the meantime, I'm going to talk to you about the persistent democratic deficit. Now, you might have learned about the democratic deficit in your EU legal or political science studies, and you might have learned this is something from the 90s, early 2000s that was popularized in the academic literature, but it's something that I argue persists to this day and that we need to take seriously in the context of creating a new EU social contract. Now, democracy is the typical starting point for a social contract because it reflects the core principles of consent, equality, and accountability, which are central to social contract theory itself. Democracy is seen as the most direct manifestation of these principles. So these three principles I mentioned, they're central to both democracy and social contract theory. That's what I'm saying they have in common. And now let's discuss them in turn. So in terms of consent, a democratic system ensures that individuals have a say in the rules that govern them, fulfilling the core idea of the social contract, which is that legitimacy arises from the consent of the governed. Through voting, representation, and participation through these three elements, democracy then operationalizes this consent. So we see consent manifest through democracy. As for equality, democracy is based on the principle of political equality, where each individual has an equal right to participate in the decision-making process. So it's not that some people have a greater say than others. This aligns with the social contract's promise of fairness and mutual respect amongst citizens. Again, that everyone is subject to the laws, for example. In relation to accountability, democracies require representatives to remain accountable to the people. This accountability ensures that the social contract is dynamic, adapting to the needs of the populace while protecting their rights. Without democracy, the social contract risks becoming imposed, favoring those in power rather than the broader population. So you have a sort of top-down approach. However, a problem I identified in past research and others have pointed to, especially in the political science literature and among civil society actors, is that the inception of the core of the EU project, which is arguably the internal market, was not done democratically. By and large, at its origins, the internal market was a project designed by elites. This refers especially to the role of industrial actors such as the European Roundtable of Industrialists, which is an industry trade association lobby group. Indeed, the Single European Act of 1986 was pivotal in realizing the EU integrated liberal market economy by constitutionalizing the objective of establishing a common market. So that's when the common market was going to be put in the treaties and working towards it as well. However, it was fundamentally a product of extensive collaboration between the Commission and industry representatives. In particular, we found that the Cofield EU white paper that formed the basis for the internal market project was copied nearly word for word from an industry-produced document. It was written by the chair of Philips, Vissedecker. And we did, at first when I started reading about this, I was like, wow, this sounds a bit almost conspiratorial, like as if this could happen. But we did, working with a historian, I looked at the documents side by side, did a textual analysis, and found that they have like striking similarities indeed. So both endorse the same industry standardization bodies that are dominated by corporate interests. The same priority fields are also highlighted, including physical, technical, and fiscal barriers, so the barriers to free movement. Both documents also propose short timelines for the implementation of the proposals, 1990 and 1992, respectively. What was excluded from the Cofield white paper is also noteworthy. Unlike other Commission internal market proposals, so proposals by other staff from the Commission and former commissioners, the white paper made no reference to environmental objectives, which was something that was promoted by industry and now something that we're struggling with to this day. So I argue this project was not based in consent, equality, and accountability. Firstly, the creation of the EU's internal market was a project conducted without the informed consent or democratic input of European citizens, raising fundamental questions about the legitimacy of the process. There was also no equality among citizens, evidently. The outcome produced by the Single European Act were fundamentally designed to benefit one group, sometimes at the expense of others. Finally, there was likewise no accountability. The meetings between the Commission and industry were held behind closed doors, with ordinary citizens getting no transparency and having no input. This lack of consent, equality, and accountability, it has had long-lasting consequences to this day. So firstly, there's the erosion of trust. The perception that the EU operates as a project of elites has fueled Eurosceptic sentiments. And while we tend to think of Euroscepticism associated with populism, right-wing circles, it has also given rise to, I'd say, legitimate criticisms of the EU in terms of its democratic credentials that we sometimes see popping up in the literature or in debates in the European Parliament, for example, or in concerns by civil society. Then there's the entrenchment of inequalities. The benefits of the internal market continue to accrue disproportionately to large corporations and wealthier member states, while smaller businesses, less affluent countries, and more vulnerable populations face persistent challenges, such as weakened protections. There were also missed opportunities for inclusivity. A more inclusive process, one that incorporated environmental and social considerations, could have laid the foundation for a truly equitable and sustainable European project. So, some steps have been taken to remedy the democratic deficit that has been present since the internal market's inception, but still strong barriers remain to achieving true democracy at the EU level, particularly in the areas of transparency, accountability, participatory democracy, and representative democracy. In terms of transparency, the EU has faced persistent criticisms in this area. So many key decisions are made in an opaque fashion. For example, the influence of lobbying groups remains hidden from public view. We have the EU Transparency Register. It's said to be mandatory, but when you actually dig deep into the implementing legislation by the respective institutions that are a part of it, you see that actually it only applies to high-level members or commissioners, and they still have significant access, but this is very done in an intransparent way. Council meetings are also not fully transparent, leaving citizens in the dark about member states negotiating positions. Likewise, trilogues, which are absolutely key at the early stage process of the legislative process, they're not transparent at all. And that's really where a lot of the core decision making in the EU happens. So it's all well and good that we have access to the agendas and the transcripts and videos of the European Parliament, for example, but when the real concrete negotiations go on in trilogues, and there's no transparency, then I'm not sure what good the transparency that we do have really is. There's also limited access to documents. While the EU has rules on access to documents, there are frequent delays, refusals, or redactions that prevent citizens and watchdog organizations from fully scrutinizing decision-making processes. And access to documents requests, that's something that I'm a part of. And what you see in practice is significant reluctance on the part of the EU institutions, especially the current EU Commission, to provide access to documents. And so there have been really recent interesting cases you might look into by EU law professors. Laurent Page, Alberto Alemano has recently filed one, and they show as well the Council's reluctance in this respect. As for accountability, the EU struggles in this area due to, firstly, weak democratic oversight. The Commission, which holds executive power, is not directly elected by EU citizens. Its accountability to the European Parliament is also often viewed as insufficient. The Council, representing member state governments, is indirectly accountable, but often evades scrutiny due to, again, like I said, opaque negotiations. There is also limited citizen control. So citizens have no direct mechanism to recall or sanction EU-level policymakers other than through periodic European Parliament elections. This weakens their ability to influence or correct decisions they disagree with. So without citizens' control, we can't really hold our decision makers to account. Next, we turn to participatory democracy, and the EU has been criticized for its shortcomings here. Firstly, there are limited tools for citizens' engagement. The European Citizens Initiative allows citizens to propose legislations, but has significant barriers to success. For example, initiatives require 1 million signatures from multiple countries, and in the end, they don't have any binding force on the Commission. I think the Commission has to give reasons for its decisions, but ultimately, it doesn't have to do anything about the actual ECIs that come on their desk. Public consultations exist, but are often inaccessible due to technical language, short timelines, or lack of public awareness. And I'd also add here that public consultations in Europe are under threat. At the moment, for example, the Commission has just announced that it's decided it will not hold public consultations or impact assessments in respect to the current omnibus proposal, which is set to simplify, in other words, deregulate legislative measures with environmental protections that were really heralded as a breakthrough under the previous Commission that are now being rolled back, and there's no public consultation going on in this respect. There's also a lack of grassroots involvement. Decisions tend to be made at the top levels of the EU, largely excluding input from local or regional organizations and ordinary citizens. We also see inequitable participation. Marginalized groups often lack the resources or platforms to participate meaningfully in EU processes. This exacerbates inequalities and alienation. So this stands in stark contrast to the access, like I said, that interest representatives, especially companies, they have the resources, they have more platforms, whether it be through formal lobbying practices or informal, or through access to EU committees. Lastly, there's also arguably a deficit of representative democracy in the EU. In this regard, the power of the European Parliament is highly limited. While the European Parliament is the only directly elected body in the EU, its powers are constrained compared to other institutions. For instance, and unlike at the national level, the European Parliament cannot independently propose legislation, leaving the agenda setting to the unelected Commission. Plus, it often, in some legislative procedures, has only an advisory role. It has limited power to remove the Commission, and similar situations. There's also a disconnect between citizens and their representatives. Many EU citizens feel that their MEPs are too remote and unresponsive to local issues, further weakening trust in the system. So these are the core problems of the modern EU democratic deficit. Now, despite the EU's democratic deficit, it can still be said that the EU upholds the foundational elements of the rule of law. It has enacted a legal framework. It generally abides by it, though some might disagree with me. And it does work to ensure through enforcement mechanisms that those subject to its rules abide by it as well. At its core, the rule of law is about ensuring that those with power are unable to arbitrarily exercise it. Now, systems across the world that lack democracy but maintain the rule of law have been referred to by academics as autocratic legalist systems. However, it probably can't be said, despite all my the problems I pointed out, it probably can't be said that the EU is autocratic, that would maybe be going a bit too far. But instead, the EU has what I call technocratic legalism. Instead of being particularly democratic, decision-making is outsourced to non-elected technocrats who then largely uphold the rule of law. But a question that is key to the formation of an EU social contract, and this is really what I want to pose to you, is whether a social contract can be born out of such a system that does not respect democracy, but does largely uphold the rule of law. After all, the legitimacy of a social contract typically hinges on both democratic consent as well as the rule of law. While the rule of law ensures order and predictability, democracy ensures that the law reflects the will and interests of the people. Now, I have tried to make a start at answering that question. It can be argued that a system that upholds the rule of law but lacks democracy can theoretically maintain some aspects of a social contract. So there are some strengths, but significant challenges arise. In terms of the strengths of the rule of law in relation to the social contract, one of them is that the rule of law ensures consistency in the application of laws, which is essential for maintaining stability and order. So the rule of law assists in upholding the implicit agreement in the social contract that individuals agree to obey laws in exchange for protection and order provided by the state. When laws are applied uniformly and fairly, citizens develop trust in the system, and this trust reinforces their willingness to abide by the social contract. Another strength of the rule of law relates to the protection of rights. The social contract operates on the understanding that individuals consent to be governed in exchange for their protection of their rights and freedoms. This is why people decide, yes, while they don't in practice, this isn't how it works, of course, but in theory, they decide, I want the protection of my rights, so I will agree to obey the rules. The rule of law ensures that these rights are safeguarded by establishing clear, enforceable laws that are supposed to apply equally to all. The rule of law also ensures fairness and justice. For the social contract to function effectively, citizens must trust that the state will treat them fairly and justly. This legitimacy is key to the social contract as it strengthens citizens' willingness to comply with the laws. The rule of law is crucial here because it ensures that laws are applied impartially. Still, without a strong democratic foundation, there are significant challenges in upholding a social contract. Firstly, like we've hinted at, there's the legitimacy deficit. A lack of democratic input means that laws and policies may not reflect the values of the people. Then there's the issues of exclusion. Without democratic mechanisms, marginalized groups or dissenting voices are often excluded from the decision-making process. Political exclusion itself poses a significant challenge to a social contract because it undermines the fundamental idea that a legitimate government is based on the consent of the governed. The social contract becomes incomplete because not everyone has a voice in that agreement. A final challenge relates to the accountability gap. Accountability is a critical factor in maintaining trust between the government and its citizens. If citizens perceive the government as unaccountable, they may no longer view it as legitimate or worthy of their adherence. Without accountability, the relationship between the state and the people become one, again, like I said, of coercion rather than mutual agreement. Nevertheless, the identification of these challenges does open the door to opportunities. Indeed, by seeing where the problems lie, we can take steps towards democratizing the new EU social contract, which this project sets out to do. We can do this by ensuring sufficient engagement and securing the consent of stakeholders, in particular, and most importantly, EU citizens, in the creation of the social contract, contributing to a true sense of participatory democracy. Moreover, an inclusive and equitable social contract can be created by ensuring the inclusion of marginalized groups and dissenting voices. Finally, the incorporation of stronger institutional and civic oversight mechanisms can also be implemented to help bridge the accountability gap. So these are the few of the opportunities we have. In sum, a social contract might be able to delicately exist in a system that has democratic deficits but upholds the rule of law, as long as the government perceives the system as fair and just. However, the absence of democratic mechanisms creates a fragile foundation, vulnerable to dissent and instability. Over time, true legitimacy and inclusivity will likely require the incorporation of democratic principles to complement the rule of law. Now, that's where the gist of my presentation ends. And now I have a few questions here, but I'm open as well to just opening the floor to debate, hearing your questions, your comments. If we don't have any right away, then perhaps I can get the discussion going by first asking, do you think I'm right in my suggestion that we need democracy for an EU social contract, despite like these democratic deficits we have? Is democracy as fundamental as I think it is, or am I totally wrong when it comes to the social contract?
Okay, so if there is any participant who wants to answer these questions, please, I will of course let the floor to the participant. If not, I can jump in because I take some notes. First of all, thank you very much for your presentation, which was very interesting and also I think it's a material for thinking, right? Let me ask you. It's not maybe answering your questions, but also some reflections about your presentation, which I think I really appreciate. My first question will be that it depends. Some of the questions you are also posing here, and also related with your presentation as a whole. My question will be how do you define democracy at the end of the day, right? And I would like to know if you find a political system in the world, or have you found a political system in the world in 25 centuries, which is really a democracy in the sense that you are talking about? Because in my impression is that you are extremely demanding with the concept of democracy. And the points that you are posing that probably we are agreeing, I think they can be considered as unfair when you are talking about the European Union. But then because the same questions can be applied to other political organizations around the world. I would like to see whether you have found a democracy in the sense that you are talking, or it is an aspirational, an ideal concept, and therefore it would be very, very, very complicated to find a full democratic system in the sense that you were mentioning. That would be my very first question. Then related with the questions that you are here placing, do we need democracy for the European social contract? Well, the question will, if we find, it depends. The answer, this question also shows that you are already thinking of that the European Union has some democratic foundations and insights, because the easier answer would be no. I mean, if you see Hobbesian, Rousseauian, Lockean, they don't ask for a democracy to have a social contract. We can have perfectly a social contract in China. We can have perfectly a social contract in the United States, which in my understanding is not a democracy either. Therefore, the answer would be no. But when you are mentioning the European Union, you are including the concept of democracy, because we're already considering that it would be a demand for the European Union. So maybe here we can find some let's say tips on whether the EU will be in a good position to have this social contract or not. I will ask you if again, do we need a democracy for the United States to have a social contract? Do we need a democracy for other country to have its own social contract? China has a social contract and it's not a democracy. And as I said, the United States is changing the social contract in a non-very democratic term. So the answer will be probably not necessarily. But the whole project is aiming to improve some of these democratic deficits that we have in the European Union, that we have in our member states, and I think we have worldwide, in the sense to provide the possibility to participate, to include, we talk about inhabitants, minorities, in order to reinforce and to have the possibility to make more democratic the whole, not only the social contract experience, but also the whole political organization, which is the European Union. So I think I made a very long comment. I apologize for this, but I mean, it's following up the topic that you were mentioning. So thank you very much.
Great. Thank you for your questions. So in relation to the first question, do we have this form of ideal democracy anywhere in the world, to which I've alluded? And I would say, obviously not. But that doesn't mean that, especially when the EU, prides itself on democracy and can be very demanding of its democratic requirements when it comes to its relations with third countries, and as well, increasingly, the member states, as we've seen with the Commission's current case based on values against Hungary. I think that we still should aspire to have a rather demanding democracy, especially when the EU claims to be representative of its citizens. And this connects to the second question as well about, no, we don't need democracy for a social contract, because, or whether we need it. And basically, I don't think I'd agree that we don't need democracy for a social contract, because, like I said, it makes it extremely fragile. If people aren't consenting to the social contract, then what is going to motivate them to abide by it, to comply with the laws that are imposed on them by those who are said to represent them? So I think that, like I said, if you have the rule of law, you might be able to delicately have one, but that it's very sensitive and predisposed to unrest, as we've seen, for example, with the January 6th situation in the United States, for instance. So I would say that to have a strong social contract, democracy is important.
Of course, I mean, I'm not denying that democracy is important in the sense to have a very strong social contract. Probably not strong, I would say a legit the social contract, especially in the 21st century. And if I don't want to monopolize the turn. So if there's another questions on the presentation, I would really like to hear it. So here is Santi. There is something that he wrote on the chat. I cannot read it because I'm on my phone.
Yes, I would say that it's definitely a bit of both. I would say that, you know, there is evidence from the Eurobarometers, for example, that, so the question, sorry, I will share with everyone. Do you think that the low voter turnout in the EP elections, which is less than 50%, is the result of the disconnection between the EP politicians and citizens, or is it a lack of communication from the EU institutions? And firstly, on the second point, we do know from Eurobarometers that there is a lack of awareness among citizens about what the EU really does for them. You know, like a lot of people don't know where the roaming rights in relation to their phones come from, the fact that they have 2 years on their manufacturer warranty instead of 1. A lot of people, they don't know this. So I think this lack of communication and lack of understanding of what the EU does for them makes people think that the EU doesn't have as much influence to the extent that it would warrant actually turning out for European Parliament elections, that they don't know what the EU can do for them and why voicing their interests would actually matter. If they think the EU does nothing for them, then obviously they aren't going to be particularly interested in turning out. But it is getting better. Turnout is getting better. And I think there is increased awareness. And the EU does have some pretty strong communications campaigns. Actually, you know, probably some of the strongest communication campaigns in the world in terms of trying to get their policies out there in the general knowledge. I am quite impressed with how accessible they try to make the lawmaking process, or the law once it's actually made, you might say. But then there's the issue, of course, between disconnect between politicians and citizens. And yeah, I'd say there still is a sense of disconnect. Like Giulia says in the chat, turnout has gotten better, but there continues to be a disconnect. Probably, I mean, this is a pattern on the national levels as well in the EU, a disconnect with politicians, but perhaps a little more aggravated on the EU level, where we connect that issue of a lack of understanding of what the EU does for them or can do for them if they express their interests. Thank you for your question.
Thank you very much. I was now curious. I knew I have already information, but I was curious to see, because with pictures and with colors, for me, it's easy to understand. If you see the world map on the index of democratic quality, and then you see the countries of the European Union and the surroundings and the world in a general picture, then it may also help us to place where the European Union in terms of comparison of democratic terms is. And it is interesting that you were mentioning Hungary and how the European Union is imposing a sort of democratic, a democratic I won't say imposition, but let's say how they are accusing Hungary to be not democratic. And if you see the quality, you see with this index, which is not made by Europeans, you see that Hungary is the country with the European Union, with Romania and with Poland, which is less democratic quality. So, I mean, it is criticism is not important, but it's necessary, definitely. But if we have a global picture of the democratic quality index in the world, I think we cannot complain that much. And I believe that probably the European Union is the best place scenario to discuss this kind of instruments. And the evidence is that this is the European Union who's paying us, I mean, not us, but the whole project, and they have a cluster and they have calls on social contract, in the sense that they really believe that this is an instrument to be applied to the European context. And I would say even more. In our proposal, when we were analyzing the calls for a new social contract, the vast majority of the authors calling for the renewal of a new social contract based on solidarity and the needs of Europe when they were facing some struggles of the pandemics and other crises, multilateral, they were Europeans asking for a new social contract. They were the people of Europe asking for a new social contract to strengthen our democratic will. So I think it's not casual. I think it's not. I think we need to take into consideration that the calls for a new social contract is in Europe, as capitalized by Europe, and it's not happening in other places around the world with the same strength. And it's Europe providing money to the people in order to democratize and establish the social contract to strengthen democracy, to strengthen also solidarity. So this is, I think, in a matter of fact, because you can see who were and who is now spending money, thinking about, unless you can tell me, well, Tony, but this is a sort of facade, you know, Europe is providing money, Europe is talking about social contract, but they don't really, from the Commission, they don't really, not the Commission, but the institutions, etc., they don't really believe that we can improve in democratic terms. I don't know. This is also a comment related with your presentation. So I would like to know, to listen to your thoughts. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. You know, it's true. The Commission, I think, is one of the actors that's most strongly trying to promote democracy at the member state level, and is taking action as well. Like you said, they are funding this project, and which has elements of democracy, and they are. And you do see other calls for proposals going out from the Commission funding bodies in relation to democratic projects and funding democracy-oriented NGOs as well, for example. But there is definitely some institutional clashes in that respect, I think, that we see, especially in the Council, in the current European Parliament that we have at this moment. There's a much more of a lack of political will, I think, from these institutions to pursue democracy at the EU level, but that maybe the Commission is working to legitimize its democracy pursuing actions through funding projects like this, funding NGOs, doing infringement actions against Hungary. It is definitely enhancing its democratic credentials and maybe giving itself a mandate to perhaps one day talk about reform when it comes to democracy at the EU level. Like, you do have this Defense of EU Democracy package that's just been released in the most recent working program. So it is something that they are definitely working towards. How much they can do as that the actor with the right of initiative remains to be seen because it depends on the rest of the political actors. But yeah, I wouldn't say that there's like no political will across the board. And I am, I'm still optimistic, definitely. But I just think it's important to, and this is something I've discussed a lot with Dimitri, who the PI on this project, who thinks there's no democracy in Europe. So I think I'm a bit more optimistic, and yeah, that we will see with this Commission's new working program what we can get done this term. Yeah.
Sorry again, because but you know, I will be hours with you talking, because this is a very interesting topic. Only a very short comment, and sorry abusing of your time, of you and all the participants. So which is the alternative? Because I mean, the problem is also the alternative. If you see, and this is also a matter of fact or opinion, that what happened in the United Kingdom after the Brexit, you will see what happens in terms of democratic backlash, right? Or if you see which is the alternative, then the same question that you are critically, and I agree with you, posing to the European Union in terms, well, the alternative, do you think it would be better to ask to ask now in Italy, and not as a part of the European Union, on a social contract for Italy with Meloni leading, or in Hungary in the terms of protection of democracy and fundamental rights? that will be, so the alternative of the European Union, I think, in terms of democracy and also respect to fundamental rights, etc., in Europe, I think it's apocalyptic. So,
Definitely.
so I mean,
Yeah.
we are forced. I agree, but not only democracy, but also all the political systems. We are forced to have some kind of belief, right? Because at the end of it, it's a question also of faith. And the problem that we are is that we are forced to believe on, because the alternative is, again, to have in the hands of the states. And we have now what happens, and especially after a process of, let's say, Brexit, of exit of the European Union, what happens with the quality of democracy of the United Kingdom in this? What happens with the quality of democracy of rights of the minorities in the United Kingdom? So that's as an example, right? And what happens what will happen with the same questions in terms of democratic improvement and backlash or not in Italy, in Spain, or in Hungary, if they were not part of the European Union? And I think, again, my impression is that it will be that the scenario is apocalyptic. So
Yeah, no, I would totally agree that but I don't necessarily think that, and so maybe I also do competition law, and my competition law hat is coming out a bit, where we look at the other alternative options, and I don't think the only alternative is no European Union. I think that the best alternative is a more democratic European Union, but because then it would actually have the credentials to be more demanding of its member states in terms of their own democracies. Because at the moment we have countries like Hungary saying, you don't have democracy at the EU level, you don't respect your values either, so why should we? And accusing the EU of hypocrisy. So I would never say, everyone should leave the EU because it's not democratic. That would be crazy.
No. I'm not saying that you are saying so, right? I mean, don't misunderstand my words. But what I'm saying is, yes, they are saying that, but they don't leave the EU. They can't leave the EU. I mean, Hungary can open the door and leave the EU, but they don't. So, which is a little bit paradoxical, right?
Yeah, I think it is a strong political chip for the those in power in Hungary to criticize the EU, despite being so dependent on their funding. But to criticize the EU is popular in some circles, and is just something that an idea that they throw around, but are not particularly serious about. Yeah.
Okay. Well, so let me thank you very much again for your presentation. It was really inspiring. I think I personally very love this kind of criticisms, because I understand that that's the only way to improve and to really achieve more democratic quality in the European Union, but also in our political organization. So, and I think it's a perfect way to end our winter school. So thank you very much.
Thank you for your questions.
And bye-bye to everybody. Agur, adeu, because I mean, everything was in English, and which is a little bit also criticisms to how things evolve in internationally speaking, right? Because some of us, we are not, English is not our mother language. So I wanted to say moltes gracias, which means thank you very much in my mother language, eskerrik asko, which is in Basque. And see you soon, hopefully, Jacquelyn and the rest of the participants. I invite you to participate in the contest that we have, and to see you and read your opinions and your comments. Thank you very much again. Bye-bye now.
Great. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you.